about the Hannibal War, I once again came to the rather gloomy thoughts that Rome in the 5th century was doomed. How does Hannibal, who lived 600 years earlier, have anything to do with the collapse of the Roman Empire? Yes, in essence, nothing, but the army recruitment system is very much so. Let's talk about it and about the change in the Romans' attitude towards war. It will probably not be a revelation to anyone that one of the reasons for Rome's victory over Hannibal and other enemies of the Republic was the very special attitude of the Romans to war. The very history of the Republic, which for a long time lived in the regime of a besieged fortress, repelling constant attacks from enemies, created among the Romans an attitude towards any war as a war of destruction. No, of course, we were not talking about the total physical destruction of all enemies, but for a Roman, defeat in war was never an option. Still, the descendants of Romulus were practical people and raised the absolute truth, which Clausewitz later formalized war as the continuation of diplomacy by other means. In such a practical attitude to the war, despite significantly different interests, both patricians and plebs were united, since for both, any defeat in the war meant that everyone would lose something, and victory promised gains. Therefore, Rome, no matter any losses after severe defeats, will again and again gather new armies and beat the enemy with them. Naturally, without a significant mobilization resource, this would have been impossible, but the mechanics of forming a militia army made the task much easier. Formally, any citizen over 17 years of age had to serve in the army of the Republic. In fact, not just anyone. Firstly, since the citizen bought the weapons himself, there was a qualification, and those who did not pass it were exempt from service. Well, who needs a man on the battlefield who can't even buy a normal sword? Secondly, the only child in the family was also usually exempt from service, since the continuation of the family was more important than the protection of the Republic in particularly difficult years. This rule was ignored. In addition, they usually recruited soldiers for one season, less often a year, even less often for a couple of years. But this is in the case of a very serious war, since if you tear the peasant away from the land for too long, then it will be bad for both the peasant and the Republic as a whole. Therefore, recruitment was carried out on a rotation basis, and each citizen from the draft lists had to serve only once every 2 to 3 years. Thus, the Republic, on the one hand, had a fairly deep mob. The reserve, on the other hand, could only keep part of it constantly deployed. Thus, Livy argued that during the war with Hannibal, Rome, together with its allies, could field an army of 700,000 infantry and 70,000 horsemen. A more conservative estimate by Delbrick speaks of a mobilization potential of approximately 500,000, which is very, very large for a country with a total population of only 5 to 7 million people. Rome itself could draft up to 240,000 people out of about 1 million citizens into the army. Naturally, Rome had much fewer soldiers on the battlefields during the Second Punic. At the peak of the war, Rome deployed up to 150,000 soldiers, and this figure is most likely overestimated, and this caused such a strong strain on the economy that Rome at the end of the war was literally on the verge of ruin, and money for the formation of new legions was collected almost by subscription. Nevertheless, it was precisely the enormous mobilization potential that allowed Rome to prolong this and other wars.
And although the system worked, it was not ideal. While the Republic fought mainly in Italy, there were no problems. But when Rome's interests extended to the entire Mediterranean, and a regular military campaign began to take several years, the old recruitment system suddenly no longer met the new requirements. Firstly, the farmer did not want to leave his land for war for several years. What would remain of his plot after 5 years of absence was a big question. Riots among the troops and reluctance to fight became, if not the norm, then a frequent occurrence, and the demands of soldiers right in the middle of a military campaign to dismiss them to their homes became completely routine. What does it matter to the ordinary Roman guy Maximus? The city of Brundisium some kind of war in Greece. When a home his field has not been plowed for many years, if the neighbors have not squeezed it out at all. This problem has been obvious for a long time. Moreover, the Republic has been around since the 3rd century BC, began to regularly pay soldier salaries in the event of long military campaigns. But somehow, this did not result in any greater zeal to serve. Secondly, the exclusion of landless and land-poor peasants who had not passed the qualifications from the mobilization resource reduced this very mobilization resource. The problem was solved by gradually lowering the qualifications until Marius abolished it altogether. The issue of equipping recruits who were unable to buy them with weapons and armor was solved simply. The basic kit was now issued at the expense of the Republic. And what would be better is to earn money for yourself through service. Well, in order for people to join the army more actively, they began to promise upon completion of service. Again, starting with Marius, land plots out of sequence according to land laws, that is, if you want to get land, but not feed worms, like the Gracchi brothers, go serve. This is how the larva of the imperial army appeared. She was distinguished by a truly enormous mobilization potential, a significant degree of training due to long periods of service, and high motivation due to the material bonuses that service promised. That, with all this, its entire mobile reserve consisted of people who were absolutely zero in terms of military training, which means it was impossible to sharply increase the number. It was necessary to spend up to a year on training. This problem was compensated for by a large number of veterans who could be recruited into service with a big push if they wanted. In this form, the Roman army would exist right up to the end of the 3rd century, losing along the way one of its main advantages, mobilization potential. And this may seem strange and surprising, since in just 400 years, the population of the Roman Empire increased from 10 million to 50 to 70 million, while expanding the possibilities of recruiting non-citizens to serve. How so? But the point here is that the mobilization potential now directly depended on the profitability of military service, and its attractiveness steadily declined over time. They paid less. They were given land further and further from Rome. They had to fight all sorts of barbarians, and so on, and so on, taking into account the fact that Rome's enemies were not decreasing. The army grew by leaps and bounds. If under Octavian Augustus Rome managed, with 150,000 soldiers in field armies and garrisons, then by the time of Constantine their number reached 400 to 500,000 in the field, comitatus and border limitant troops. At the same time, the social hiring base for the army was narrowing all this time. In civilian life, it was possible to live well without risking your life, even as a homeless person, thanks to the Roman social system, grain distributions. By the 5th century, at the moments were not the same for a long time. No joke, 600 years have passed since the time of Hannibal. During this time, generations grew up for whom no one from the family served at all and was not even close to it. The army was still a social elevator, but for the majority of citizens it was completely unnecessary. So the basis of the legions were mainly either hereditary military men or residents of barbarian provinces, such as Illyricum, for whom the usual methods of advancement through the civilian branch were severely limited.